Welcome to audio highlights for Chapter 12, Individuals and Families of Latin Descent. This chapter starts out by reminding us about how heterogeneous this group is. It's also a very large group in the U.S., so the population is over 50 million of Latina or Latinos currently in the United States at the date of our text, and that accounts for about 16% of the U.S. population. So this is definitely a cultural group that no matter what field you pursue, it's important to learn about their different cultural practices and also how to work with these individuals and families. So it's also challenging to learn about the history of this group because they come from so many different countries. So Latina and Latinos living in the U.S. come from around 19 countries, and our text goes through a few of those, but before we get to that, it's important to point out some of the challenges that this group faces, and really those can be summarized in terms of obstacles to political, social, educational, and emotional stability. So there are gaps in high school diploma achievement, for example. 39% of Latinos do not have a high school diploma. Of those that are employed, many are employed at lower level jobs that therefore have lower incomes, and they may not do things like be able to afford a house or pay for education for their children. Child care may be a challenge in terms of the income levels that many people, especially if you don't have a high school diploma, are able to earn. So after looking at the challenges as a whole for this group, our text then looks at some of the individual nationalities that represent this population. So the majority of U.S. Latinos come from Mexico. And so this immigration history has been heated for years and years in terms of debates around immigration, whether it be illegal immigration or legal immigration. And so there remain to be issues of discrimination for this group, very limited socioeconomic advancement, and even when people are here legally, there's a large high school dropout rate and low rates of college completion. The second largest group in the United States are Puerto Ricans, and so some of their outcomes are slightly better than from Mexican Americans, but they still are less likely to do things like own a home, and they may be less likely to have a median income that compares to the majority population. So lastly, our text talks about those from Cuba and those from Caribbean and other kind of Central and South American countries. These two groups make up less in terms of the percentage of immigration to the United States, but it also depends on where in the country you're talking about. So in South Florida, for example, that's a high concentration area for Cuban Americans, and so it would be very important to learn their specific cultural habits and practices in that area especially. So after taking a look at the individual countries that Latinos might immigrate from, or their parents or grandparents might have come from, it's then important to look at the overall cultural and values practiced by this group. And so there's a few new words that might be introduced to you in this chapter, and most of them come from Spanish in their origination, so for that reason alone they may be new and unfamiliar. So at first there's a phrase introduced called somos inmigrantes, meaning we are immigrants, and so it's this joint community feel that in many ways is a shared aspect of culture no matter which country Latina and Latinos may come from, and the feeling that even if it was their parents or their grandparents that were first generation immigrants, they still feel as though they have come to this country and that it's not entirely their own, or that they're treated as equals, or not discriminated against on a consistent basis. So that's both a challenge but also a unification in a way that many of these people that may come from very different countries and may have very different pasts in terms of values and practices and beliefs have this shared culture here in the United States. So there's also a shared religion and spirituality. Most Latinos identify as Christian, around 90%, and most of those identify as Roman Catholic. And there's roots to those trends as well, which your text goes into a little bit more detail. All right, so I wanted to introduce those new terms, which are important to think about. The first two are related to gender roles, so machismo and marianismo. So machismo is actually, this one is used a little bit more, I think, in general language, and what it means is a strong, virile, omnipotent man who takes care of his family by providing food and shelter. And so the base word that you may have heard from this is macho. It's a very quote unquote manly man, whatever our culture ascribes that to mean. And it's the idea of doing whatever it takes by whatever means necessary to provide for your family. It also, sometimes our culture interprets it to mean something a bit like being the dominant one in a family. So also making sure that kind of you're at the top of the pyramid. In contrast, Marianismo, which is less known in our general language and culture, it's a belief that requires a woman to be pure, make sacrifices for the husband and children's benefit, so to put their needs first, and not to do things like engage in premarital sex, to be very nurturing, and to be a role model. So it's important to assess where a client might fall in their belief system or in observation of these traditional gender roles, or how these traditional gender roles impact them. Maybe their parents strongly believe in these gender roles, or their grandparents or their aunts who they live with. But it's also very important to assess your own attitudes towards these beliefs around gender roles. And this may be the first time that you've heard about them, but think in terms not only of, is this a belief system that you ascribe to, but also how could you work well with someone who did ascribe to these beliefs? Remember, it's never our goal to kind of impose our beliefs on others, and an excuse of that you believe yours is more right or more just or equal is no excuse really to impose your beliefs on others. So it's important to self-reflect on how you feel about these gender roles. Another new term is familissimo, and this means that an individual would think about parents, siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and even close friends when they make decisions. And so this can be very new for a counselor who is used to working just one-on-one with an individual and kind of making decisions, helping that individual to make decisions for themselves. Sometimes this can be misinterpreted as somebody who is relying overly on others or who can't make up their own mind. So we really need to understand that in many cases with this population, it can be part of their cultural belief system. And lastly, we have just two more terms that I want to introduce, and these relate to interpersonal relationships. We have personalissimo, which just really means a warmth, nurturing, affection about others, and confianza, which is a trust and confidence. So I want you to think in terms of these concepts as to how they might apply to a counseling relationship or to a human services relationship. So this may be some common ground that you could work together to build from. There may be new terms to you, but they likely aren't new concepts to you. So again, reflect on what they mean to you and how you might integrate these in a dialogue from someone of Latin American descent. So this chapter, like previous ones, also gives you some good guidelines in working with people that may be from Latin descent, and I also like the way that it spends some extra time focusing on special considerations that you might have for working with adolescents of Latin descent. Many times adolescents are challenged by what we call bicultural statuses. So they may be going to school with primarily, hopefully a very diverse school population, but where they may speak English well, and they may not really be noticing large aspects of their Latino culture at school. Then they may come home to a culture very immersed in the ways of their home country. Their home life might be spent speaking Spanish, and so it's kind of living these dual worlds. And that can be challenging because there can be difficulty reconciling those two worlds, especially if the worlds involve very different things like gender roles or feelings towards sexual orientation. There are also a number of other challenges, as we've mentioned before, in terms of low socioeconomic status, difficulty buying homes, difficulty with housing. So because of that, these adolescents might be limited in their ability to play sports after school or to participate in extracurricular activities. So we also know that the adults in the household are also at risk for some unique stressors. So often many families live intergenerationally. So we know that first generation means that that individual immigrated from their home country. So if I were to say a first generation Latina, I might mean that this person is female and immigrated from, let's say, Mexico, for example. If I were to say second generation Latina, then that would tell me that this is a person whose parents immigrated from a country of Latin descent. So that's some of the terminology that you will run into. But it's important to think of in these intergenerational homes, you may have adults that are caring for elderly parents. You may have adults that are facing discrimination in the workplace or underemployment. And again, that difficulty connecting with children due to biculturalism. Some families become very frustrated because they feel like that their cultural beliefs and ways of living are almost being pushed out the door as their adolescents are becoming more and more immersed in westernized mainstream U.S. culture. So that can be really challenging for families, especially those that value and really want to hang on to important aspects of their Latino culture. Lastly, I wanted to encourage you to look at, we talk in this chapter about a systems approach to counseling, and really that means looking at all the different systems that influence our life and those of our clients as well. I want you to take a moment on page 337. There's a box called Build Your Knowledge, and it talks about an eco map, which was previously called an ecological genogram. And these are visual depictions of the systems that influence an individual's world. So there's a great example for you on 338, and this example might have been drawn by a client of Latin descent. So it not only shows the individual, but also their relationship to all these different systems, and then the lines kind of indicate whether this relationship is positive, negative, or strained. So you can think about how helpful this would be if you were working with an individual to know what an influence these different, even government agencies or these different family members have in this person's life. So this is a little bit different than the genogram, which we'll be doing in a session very soon, but this is still a great way to find out more about someone or find out more about yourself. So I hope that you'll take the time to read this section and maybe even to sketch out your own eco map.